It's been a manic summer on the house build and I'll hopefully be doing an update video on that shortly. But in today's video I thought I'd show you how I constructed this fence last week. I have got a few fence builds on the channel, but each one is different, and this one threw up some particularly tricky challenges. A quick update on why we need this fence. At the start of the works we ripped out this very large tree trunk which left the fence, which had been inundated for years with ivy, pretty pulverised around the base. And then with the garden largely finished we had to destroy an 8.5 metre section of it so we could cart out all the waste from underpinning the foundations of the cottage up through the neighbouring field. And what do I mean by challenges? Well, we've got a gradual slope to take into account, and also how to support the fence, particularly here where the ground starts a whopping 2.5 metres off the floor before we started building a wall. And obstacles making it hard to space a post evenly, not to mention in a straight line. Now, choosing the right fence will depend on a number of factors, including ease of installation, your views on whether wooden posts will stand the test of time, or whether you'd prefer those concrete posts that you slot panels into, or even the concrete spurs that you bolt the fence posts to, which are particularly used for where your fence posts have rotten. Also, do you want a continuous run of fencing or fencing panels? Like this. They're a bit overgrown now, but this is what they used to look like. In my case, I wanted to match this existing run of fencing that I installed a couple of years ago. There's a link to that video coming up on screen now. And I had gradually sloping ground to negotiate. And I wanted to have a gradually sloping profile rather than the stepped profile you'd have to have if you were using a panelled fence. So I decided to continue with this traditional closeboard option, which is supported by these Arris rails along the back and these fairly substantial 100 by 125mm posts with V-shaped notches to support the Arris rails along the line of the fence. Now, this closeboard Arris rail system gives you great flexibility in terms of being able to position your posts wherever you need to. Because whilst typically you'd want to position the posts 3 metres apart, because that's generally the length that these Arris rails come in, you obviously don't have to do that, because if, like me, you've got to position the post somewhere else, you can just trim your Arris rails to suit. Same goes with the gravel boards along the bottom, although mine came in even longer, 3.6 metre lengths. The big benefit of these gravel boards is they keep the Featheredge boarding off the ground, stopping it rotting. And also, it's much easier to replace a rotten gravel board than it is to start ripping the Featheredge boards out from the fence. You've got the added advantage with this system of the capping rail at the top, which basically covers the end grains of the Featheredge boarding, which I think is also quite a nice touch and makes the fence look a bit more substantial. So let's have a quick look at today's toolkit. Now, in terms of the fence itself, this is what I ordered. Nice little rule of thumb when you're working out what your feather boards, times the meterage of your intended fence by 10. And that will give you the number of boards you need, taking into account 25mm overlap. Maybe sling in another one per metre, that gives you a few more for wastage. Order like I did from a local supplier, then you can keep popping back if you need extra stuff or you need to take stuff back, as I did with this fence post that had dried out too quickly and cracked. And the whole thing came to 346 quid, which I didn't think was too bad. The Featheredge boards, by the way, are 128mm wide, and you can get different thickness of gravel board. In this case, I've gone for 6x1 in old money, or 150mm by 25mm. I've got this very fast setting cement, which is a must when you're setting fence posts. Bostik bituminous paint, another one of my products I love because it helps stop things rotting. And a jam jar with water in it. I can't wait to show you that trick. My ever faithful Mutt Pro digging tool, a spade. Hammer and saw, obviously, and then a range of power tools. You can use as many or as few as you want, but every one you use will make your job easier. And this particularly applies to the nail gun, and I think I might have slightly over-ordered on the 51mm galvanised ring nails. Exterior screws, and something I couldn't manage without these days, my Ansel work gloves. And if you're really unlucky, you might need a crazy tool like this concrete breaker. There'll be links to all of this stuff in the description below the vid. The total width for the space was 8.2 metres, and I now had a big bank that needed retaining somehow. I bought these sleepers to build a new retaining wall for the bank, but had so many bricks from taking out the internal walls in the kitchen that I decided we should use these instead, and set about cleaning each individually with my SDS drill and the chisel bit so that my builders could build a new sloping wall. And in laying the concrete foundations for the wall, they made me this nice shuttered hole for the first fence post. But this fence post here was giving me a bit of a problem. My fence posts are 2.7 metres long. I think that's the maximum you can get in V-notch, I might be wrong. But this section here, as I said earlier on, was 2.5 metres off the floor. And I knew that because I strung a rope between the old fence and where I wanted the new fence to end. and you really want your fence post to be in the ground by a good 600 millimeters. So what I did is go down to my local farm DIY store and order a 12-foot or 3.6 meter by 100 millimeter square section of post. Now these are obviously not as substantial as the V-notch posts I'd got, and I was worried about particularly notching into that post. So what I did here was go a bit off-piste and glue and bolt to the back a 4x2 or 100 by 50 millimeter section of timber. I used an old jar of Sudal polyurethane glue for this, didn't quite have enough, and I'm slightly worried about the issues with gluing two bits of timber together, opening yourself up in the future for sort of water getting in and rotting the post, but we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Speaking of rotting, a lot of people after my last fence repair video said that what I should be doing is bolting my fence post to concrete spurs, and they're probably right. And in fact, if you look at the posts that we ripped out that were put in, I'm guessing in the 1970s, using this approach, you can see that after all these years the posts themselves were absolutely fine. But I've always done it the traditional way. The posts are obviously tannalized. Don't think that tannalizing is as effective as it used to be since they stopped using nasty things like arsenic. But anyway, it's the first line of defense. And what I also do is coat the part of the post that's going into the ground with a Bostik bituminous paint. You can also soak the fence post in creosote if you can get hold of it. I have experimented in the past with post savers, but I recently inspected the fence which I'd use these for, and I was horrified to find that one of the post saver sleeves, actually a couple of them, had actually come away from the fence post and was basically creating a reservoir for water to form behind. So actually they were accelerating the process of rotting rather than preventing it. So my advice to you would be don't bother with those, and if you are going to do anything, do what I've done, or perhaps creosoting. And a quick tip here, whenever you're using an oil-based paint or bituminous paint like this, store the paintbrush in water, and then whenever you need to use it, take it out of the jar, give it a quick shake. It's as soft as it was the day you put it in, and then when you finish you can simply dunk it back in the jar and leave it there until next time you need to use it. I've saved so many paintbrushes since I started doing this. Can't believe I didn't start doing it earlier. It was time to concrete in that first post so my builder Gaz could get on with building his wall. This is the most simple, joyful part of the process. You simply fill a third of the hole with water, then pour in concrete until it comes over the surface of the water. This was a seriously deep hole, much deeper than it needed to be actually, and it took pretty much 3 bags of concrete. Give it good tamp with an old stick to remove any air pockets. Add additional concrete to use up any water that is revealed after the tamping. Sprinkle water over any dry patches, and the real beauty of this stuff, you've got 5 to 10 minutes to adjust the post to get it absolutely plumb before it sets hard. With the post in and a pretty good idea of the final profile of the top of the fence from my string lines, I could trim off the post with my 18-volt chainsaw. It really needs a bit of attention because the chain, as you can see here, is running far too slack at the moment for some reason. And you know I said I ran out of that Sudal glue? Well, I was worried about the gaps left between the two pieces, and I found an entire tube of this after bolting them together. So I reapplied this to the gaps in the hope that this will stop the weather getting in. You can see how it expands in this sped up sequence. So post 1 had been nice and simple. Post 2, 3 and 4 were less straightforward. For the second post at the far right of the run, I had to remove as much of the old concrete post as possible. Another reason perhaps for simply bolting the new post into it. I used my McAllister concrete breaker to remove as much as I could. Although if I'm honest, I ended up setting the new post next to the stub of the old one, which I couldn't completely get rid of. Post needed trimming down at the base, and so I thought I'd show you how you can save yourself a lot of manual sawing by using a circular saw and rafter square to do the bulk of the work. With the concreting done and this time a bit of manual hoiking to get it plumb, the post was in position. So I said at the start, the great thing about this fence system is its flexibility. Fence post number 3 here, I couldn't space 3 meters from post number 2. That would have taken it here, but as you can see, we've got a bit of the wall foundations at the bottom here, so I had to bring it forward of that foundation. Whereas the final fence post, we could put much more in its sort of normal place, which is just under 3 meters from the last post. And the complication with that one, other than having to remove a certain amount of the old ivy inundated fence, was finding the pipe from my oil tank down to the house was right in the middle of the post hole. Just as well, my Mutt Pro digging tool is getting a bit blunt now. Still, a little bit of improvisation and the hole was ready for the post and concreting. And notice again the string line, which enabled me to line up the top of the posts and more importantly the V notches for the next stage. With the posts all concreted in, I could turn my attention to the Arris rails. I was initially a bit worried about angling these into the V notches as they're designed to enter at 90 degrees to the post, but they fit pretty well. As this was, as usual, a one-man operation, I used clamps to hold each end in place until I screwed the rails into the post. And looking back at this footage, I should probably have used the longer 75mm exterior screws than these slightly shorter decking screws. Time will tell. I also put an angled cut on the end of each to keep the end parallel to the post. So that was all fine, but back to that original longer post and we had another problem. My builder had built the wall a good 30mm away from the post, which meant there would be a gap between the gravel board and the wall if I didn't somehow bring the fence forward of the post. So I decided to reduce the depth of the V notches, which had the added advantage of weakening that post less than if I'd notched it fully. And if I'd known I'd be doing this, I probably wouldn't have bothered bolting that extra piece to the back. It was then onto the 2x1 counter battens that will be supporting the capping rails. Bit of a mistake here, it would have been much easier if I'd notched the post for these before setting the post in the ground. But again, that multi-material saw you just saw me using for the V notches came to the rescue. That has just made a terrible job effortless. I then cut an angle on the top of each post to match the slope with my reciprocating saw so that the counter battens would sit flat on it, and I treated each newly cut notch, basically anything freshly cut, with more of that bituminous paint. With these notches done, it was then a simple job screwing the counter battens into place. Nothing has been straightforward on this job, and the same goes with the gravel boards. The first job was to cut a notch in the old concrete spur, as it was in the way of the gravel board, but my Titan 240V angle grinder with diamond disc made easy work of this. And back to that post set back from the wall, I used glazing packers to bring the gravel board forward and into line with the front of the Arris rails, which you'll remember were only partially notched into the post above. This little section to cut around the wall foundations, again bring on the circular saw, such a versatile tool for this. And finally I had a bit of scribing to do to get the gravel boards to accurately follow the profile of the wall where it levelled out. It would be easier if my builder Gaz hadn't levelled the wall out here, and I sank a couple of short posts in concrete to secure the gravel boards too in this area. I also screwed a 50x25mm batten to the left hand fence place to give me something to screw the old fence into. With the slope of the fence I needed to cut an angle on the boards. I could easily cut the bottom of the boards in bulk batches using my miter saw, although you could use a circular saw or hand saw for that matter. If you saw my garage re-roof video, you'll remember that I bought this Hikoki nail gun because I wasted a ton, literally, of money hiring misfiring Pazload gas nail guns. The 18V Hikoki literally hasn't misfired once. It's one of my best investments. On the big fence build at the bottom of the garden, I made a jig to secure a consistent overlap without having to measure each one. I don't know where it is and I can't be bothered to make a new one, so instead I made two 25mm marks on each board, top and bottom, after cutting them, and every few boards I double checked with a spirit level to make sure the boards weren't deviating from the vertical. I still needed to cut the top of the Featheredge boards flush with the counter battens, and had a little experiment from the back with my multi-material saw using the counter batten as a guide, and then from the front with my circular saw freehand to a pencil line drawn with my spirit level to get the job done. Both methods have their merits, it's a question of which one you're most comfortable with. All that remained was for me to secure the capping rails, which I screwed in place through the counter batten below, as I thought that if I screwed it down from above, water might in time get in through the screw holes. Except I wasn't quite done. I had an offcut of Arris rail left from the last fence build, so I used this to make a couple of mid-run supports to screw the gravel boards to, just to make them a bit more sturdy in this area. So that's it, the fencing was finally complete, and now all that remains is for me to do all the landscaping around it, which I think will end up happening sometime in the spring, because right now I've got some pretty urgent jobs that need doing, like for example this roof. I've got the patio grouting that needs finishing, and I've got a water main to move, all before the winter sets in. If you watch my channel regularly, I'm sorry you haven't seen many videos recently. There'll be loads coming up on the things I've just mentioned, so stay tuned for that. Don't forget, everything I've talked about today will be in the description below the video, and if you're new to my channel, it would mean so much to me to have you subscribe. You can do that by clicking on the link here, and don't forget to click the bell notification icon so you get notified of all my future uploads. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.